Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and thank you for joining me for a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today I'm going to be talking about my absolute favorite aspect of ufology, and that is onboard UFO encounters. The title of today's episode is Let Me Remember 7 Astonishing Onboard UFO Encounters. I have 7 cases for you today, dating from 1976 up to 2014. One is from outside of the United States, Brazil, and 6 are from inside the United States, including Connecticut, 2 from New Jersey, 1 from Ohio, 1 from Texas, and 1 from Wyoming. I think these cases are very important. I wish they were taken more seriously, because really everything we know about extraterrestrials comes from these kinds of cases. These cases have the most information about who these ETs are, where they come from, and why they are here. Of the 7 cases I'm presenting today, 2 do involve multiple witnesses. Only 2 involve the use of hypnosis, so we can put to rest any explanations that say these cases are false memory syndrome derived only from hypnotic regression. It's simply not true. 5 of these cases are fully conscious encounters. So I think these cases are tremendously important, and that's why I do this research and why I like to focus on onboard cases whenever possible. So let's just get started. The first case I'd like to talk about today, I remember it like yesterday. This occurred in June of 1976 in LaPorte, Texas. It involves 2 witnesses, 2 siblings, and this is a really interesting case. I think the witnesses in this case had absolute proof that this was a real encounter, not only because they shared this amazing experience, but they had physiological evidence as well as landing traces indicating that yes, this was a physical event that happened to them. This case involves 2 siblings, a brother and a sister, who shared a somewhat harrowing onboard UFO encounter when they were both very young kids. I've given them the pseudonyms Marcy and Mitch. Mitch was about 10 years old, and Marcy was a few years younger. It was one day in June 1976 that they had gone to visit their grandmother, and afterwards they were walking back to their home in LaPorte, Texas. It was evening, and Mitch, the older brother, was pointing out various constellations to Marcy and teaching her what they were. They were in a field by their home when, without warning, a UFO appeared overhead. As Marcy says, "We saw a gold-colored light come from the south and hover over us. I thought it was an airplane at first, but as it got closer, I realized it wasn't making any noise. I remember being afraid, but my brother was excited." So her brother Mitch looked up at the object in amazement and shouted out, "Oh wow, they are real!" Marcy was a little bit panicky and afraid, so she grabbed his arm and tried to pull him to the house. But he just laughed and said, "Calm down, they won't hurt us." As Marcy says, "He was my brother, so I trusted him to protect me. I stood behind him as the light came to the ground and landed." Now, per Marcy, this craft looked black. It had a shape that was hard for her to describe, kind of like a triangle or a pyramid that was missing the top section. She said it had a couple of windows in the midsection, and the bottom of the craft emitted a green-blue light which shone directly down onto the ground. This craft didn't actually land, but was hovering about 1 or 2 feet above the ground, and as soon as it stopped moving, an opening appeared on the side facing them, and at that point, a tall, slender being emerged from the opening and began to approach the 2 children. As Marcy says, the being looked almost human, with a large, odd-shaped head, almond eyes the color of absolute darkness, and a small slit below where the nose slits were. It was very tall compared to my brother, maybe 6 or 7 feet. When it exited the ship, I heard a noise like a soft murmuring bunch of voices. I was immediately soothed. I felt suddenly sleepy, but then the entity took my hand and my brother's hand. I don't remember it walking to us, but I remember how cold its hand was and how rubbery it felt. I felt like I was floating. It was taking us to its ship. We went inside and the slot closed behind us. So both children now found themselves inside this craft in an environment that was totally unfamiliar to them. And there were more of these tall beings inside. As Marcy says, "It took us to a room where my brother was taken by another being, and I was led to a table. I screamed for my brother, but the being picked me up and sat me on the table, placed his fingers on my eyes, and I couldn't move or talk anymore. I was laid on the table and my clothes were taken off. I remember there being a soft pink light and 3 beings in the room with me. There was a straw-like tool hanging above me, that one being put against my belly button. I remember a searing pain below my belly button and smelling hot metal like copper. I screamed, but then the pain was gone. I looked towards one of the beings and saw my brother on the table near mine. He was looking at me with tears in his eyes, and I could hear his voice, but his lips weren't moving." So speaking telepathically, Marcy heard her brother's voice in her mind saying, "I'm sorry, I was wrong. I love you." As Marcy says, "I felt warm where before I was so cold. The being stopped moving as my brother and I talked without moving our lips. I would think at him and then hear his voice responding to me. We've never been able to do that before. After a few minutes, my brother looked away from me, and I felt him slip away mentally. Then he screamed like he was being murdered. I thought they were killing him, but I couldn't see anything because one of the beings moved between us and started looking in my ears with a bright light." So this physical exam was the scariest and most unpleasant part of the whole experience for Marcy, particularly when the beings physically touched her. As she says, "I remember the gray color of those 3-fingered hands, the way they seemed to be rubber straws. The tips against my skin felt terribly similar to frog's flesh. They pried open my eyes when I tried to scrunch them shut and put a jelly substance in them. Then they stuck something up in my nose that hurt so bad I passed out." And that was the end of the encounter, or at least all that Marcy was able to recall happening. And as Marcy says, "When I woke up, the ship was gone. My brother was lying in the ditch a few feet from me, and I thought he was dead. I heard my mother calling for me and my brother, so I sat up and called back to her. She ran to me from our yard to where my brother was lying, and when she saw him, she screamed. She picked him up and grabbed my hand, carrying him into the house. She asked me what happened as she laid him on the couch." So Marcy was about to answer and talk about the encounter when she got a nosebleed. So she went and got a washcloth for her nose while her mother washed Mitch's face with another cloth, which woke him up. And Marcy's mother told him, "It's 3 in the morning. Why are you out at 3 in the morning? Why?" As Marcy says, "My brother told her about the craft, and I did too. But she said she thought we were trying to make stuff up. She said it was obvious someone had beaten us up. We saw how bad our story upset her, so we agreed that it was the local bully that beat us up. After my brother went to bed, when she thought we were asleep, my brother came into my room and we talked about it, and agreed not to talk about it again. But the next day, curious to see if there was any evidence of this craft, they hiked out into the yard looking for signs that anything had happened, and sure enough, they saw a little portion of grass that had been pressed down as if a heavy weight had been on top of it. But as they promised each other, the subject was not brought up again for many years. In fact, it wasn't until about 30 years later that they spoke about it, and Marcy decided to file an official report in 2015. And as Marcy says, "We kept it secret until now. It's been almost 30 years now, and only recently have my brother and I spoken of the incident. I still remember it like it was yesterday, and so does he." My heart really goes out to those 2 kids. That was clearly a pretty traumatic event for them. I would love to speak to them because I am guessing that that was not a one-off. Usually when someone is taken on board, they have encounters throughout their life. Hard to say for sure, but I would also suspect that, contact being generational, that perhaps they have relatives who've also had contact. But I'm glad that they found the courage to come forward. I'm really glad that they had each other to sort of verify their encounters, because a lot of people don't. The vast majority of people who have this experience are alone when it happens. Definitely an important case. So now let's move to the next one, which I call a calm I can't explain. This is another multiple witness case. This occurred on September 7, 1980 in southeastern Wyoming. The exact location is being kept secret, but what's interesting about this case is not only is it a multiple witness case, the witnesses came forward and allowed their real names to be used. It's a really fascinating case. This one does involve the use of hypnosis, but to me what's super interesting about this case is what happened afterwards. This case was investigated by Dr. Leo Sprinkle, PhD, and was presented at the Rocky Mountain UFO Conference in 1981 by the principal witnesses. It took place not far from Bosler, Wyoming, which is the location of the famous Pat McGuire Ranch, a well-known UFO hotspot. Pat McGuire has had a lot of UFO experiences and is quite well known in this field. At any rate, the witnesses were a married couple, Gene Gautreaux, a machinist, and his wife May. They were on an elk hunting trip, and on the evening of September 7, 1980, they retired to their tent for the evening. It was a warm night, so they left the tent flaps open. And about 5 a.m., Gene was awakened by a shuffling noise outside his tent. And as he says, "I sat up and looked out the tent door, and there was a bright light about 30 feet above the ground behind the aspen trees. It was white and had red and green flashing lights on it." Gene immediately woke up his wife May and said, "What is that?" She replied, "I can't distinguish it. It's too bright." The next thing they noticed was a big orange object that looked kind of like the moon, but it clearly wasn't. It was illuminating the road and slowly moving towards the west. As Gene says, "The first thing I felt was fear. I grabbed for a pistol and a light. I didn't know what it was. I wasn't thinking UFO. I was just thinking that there was someone out there." So his wife spoke up and said, "You are not going out there." Gene stared at her for a moment, put the gun back and said, "No, I'm not going out there." But what happened next both surprised and puzzled him. As Gene says, "A calm that I can't explain came over both of us at the same time. Whatever was out there, we felt wasn't going to harm us. I guess we felt that we ought to go back to sleep, with those strange lights in front of us. So we both lay down, looking out the door. At some point, May said, 'The other light is gone. Now, all the insides of the trees are all lit up.'" Now, despite the fact that this was obviously very unusual, Gene found himself casually saying, "Oh yeah, good night," and they both fell asleep. Gene describes what happened next. As he says, "We woke up 3.5 hours later. When we did, my wife was complaining of a sore mouth. She couldn't move her jaw. And the whole inside of the tent was covered with dirt and leaves. It was a new tent, and we were pretty careful about it. We took off our shoes when we went into it. We didn't have any kids to track it in, so we know that we didn't track it in. But there sure was a pile of dirt in there. And my pistol was over at the other side of the tent under the table, the holster and everything. I just felt strange, and I decided I wasn't going to elk hunt that day." So Gene told her, "Let's get out of here." May agreed, and they packed up and left. Driving down the road, Gene saw a dead cow with 3 vultures sitting on it, picking at it. Gene wanted to stop and take a closer look. May said it was fine, but told him, "I'm not going with you." So he went to the cow and saw that it had a perfect circle cut into its chest. It was clear to him that the wound was not caused by predators. As Gene says, "So we went home kind of confused about everything that happened to us." Finally, they spoke about their experience to their friends, Pat and Wanda McGuire, who recommended that they go visit Dr. Leo Sprinkle, who was of course an expert on UFO encounters. And after speaking with them and hearing about their experiences, Leo suggested regressive hypnosis. They agreed, and over the next 6 weeks had a series of hypnosis sessions. These sessions revealed what had happened during the missing 3.5 hours of time. They had both been taken on board a craft by apparent extraterrestrials. As Gene says, "Under hypnosis, it came out that they actually did come to our tent. There were 3 of them that my wife had seen standing outside, and they were conversing in some manner, trying to make us go with them, I guess. And I remember them coming into the tent and taking my wife. I just sat there, go ahead, and I went next, and I didn't fight them either. I don't remember seeing her, but I remember sitting inside a room near a table. They were using some sort of lighted probe on my ear and my stomach. So Jean did get a good look at the UFO occupants and describes what appears to be tall grays. As Jean says, they looked like they had duct tape all over them, a silver gray type uniform. They were quite tall, up to 6 feet tall, some of them 5'7", very lean, large craniums, large eyes. I was a little perturbed. They wouldn't talk with me. They knew better, I guess. Jean also got a pretty good look at the room they were in, and as he says, I remember seeing the room. The room was kind of strange. It was oval-like. There was a big box in the center of it, and it had sort of smoke inside of it. I don't know what the smoke was, but it was a clear plastic box. That was really all Jean was able to remember, and as he says, the next thing I knew, I woke up 3.5 hours later. I guess this all took place in the time that we slept. But it was the aftermath of the encounter that was almost as strange as the encounter itself. Because in the year that followed, they began getting a series of strange phone calls. And every time they'd answer the phone, nobody would be on the line. It happened so often that Jean finally went down to the police station and had them put a tap on their phone. And despite an official investigation, they couldn't find anything unusual. The calls did stop after about a month, and then they started up again. Another apparent after effect was the sudden appearance of very strong psychic abilities in them both. As Jean says, ESP has been involved with us. We started seeing things before they happened. I saw President Reagan get shot 20 minutes before it happened. My daughter did too. I was at an archery club and I saw a guy's bow break 15 seconds before it broke. It snapped and hit him in the face. Just strange things are happening to us. Now, despite all this high strangeness, ultimately Jean and May feel that their encounters were beneficial. As Jean says, we do feel very positive about our lives, that things are going very well for us, and we feel that we have learned something. We don't understand what it is, but it is something that has helped us. We think that some catastrophe is going to happen, and we feel that Laramie Peak is the place to go. Jean does report that there are many other things that happened to him that are related to this, but this is all he shared at the conference. I find that case particularly fascinating because these witnesses describe exactly what so many other contactees described, which is having a huge escalation of psychic abilities following their encounters. So I think that's clearly related. Kudos to them for coming forward. Not a lot of people can find the strength and courage to do that. So I am absolutely honored when people do come forward and share their encounters and even allow their real names to be used. It's another, I think, important case. All of these cases are tremendously important. One of these days, Congress is going to have to admit that people are having direct contact. Because again, this is the very heart of the UFO phenomena. These are the cases that offer us the greatest opportunity to learn so much. For that alone, they should be taken seriously. So now let's move to the next case. This one is fairly straightforward, but it's still an interesting case. I call this one Examined by Extraterrestrials. This occurred on January 12, 1990 in Curitiba, Brazil. This is a single witness case for the most part, though the witness's family does verify some of these events. This is a really interesting case in terms of how the witness described recalling his event, and what happened on board is also very interesting. This very interesting and compelling case comes from Jackson Camargo of the Grupo de Estudos de Pesquisas Ufológicas de Campinas. In other words, the Ufology Study and Research Group of Campinas. It also appears in Mario Rangel's book, Alien Abduction. It actually involves several incidents. In January of 1990, the witness, a teenager by the name of Vanderlei, was at his grandmother's house in a rural area of Curitiba. One evening, he stepped out to use the outhouse, and he saw a 12-foot wide metallic golden sphere floating high above his house. Frightened, he tried to run back to the house, but suddenly found himself unable to move. The last thing he could recall was this object rising quickly into the sky and disappearing into the distance. It was several months later, in October that same year, Vanderlei awoke in the middle of the night and saw 3 bright figures standing at the bedroom door. He was again paralyzed as one of the entities approached him. He felt an intense cold and passed out. Following this, he began having a repetitive dream of being chased, and in the dream he would lose his strength and collapse, and of course the dream would end. It was 7 years later, in 1997, he had a vivid dream that he woke up, opened the backyard door, and saw a luminous floating object, a UFO. The next morning, he found that the door was in fact wide open. This was a small clue that this might have been more than just a dream, and this was verified by his father. When other similar events continued to occur, Vanderlei finally decided to try hypnosis. 2 sessions were conducted, and under hypnosis, he was taken back to January 12, 1990, when he had stepped out of his grandmother's house and saw this golden sphere hovering and then darting away. But this time, under hypnosis, he recalled that the sphere emitted a solid, coherent beam of opaque white light that struck him and levitated him upwards. He estimates that he was about 30 feet above the house. He could see everything in clear detail below him. The craft was metallic and had windows around it and an opening like a doorway. He was floated up through the opening where a shadowy being was waiting. Once inside this object, he saw another being. One being was in front of him and another behind, and he was floated down this corridor to another door, which opened into a small, windowless room where he was placed on a sort of examination table. He said the interior was hot and he began to perspire heavily. He said the table was surrounded by strange machines and apparatus that he was unable to describe, but he now saw 3 beings who he did describe as short, with disproportionately large heads, enormous black eyes, a small, almost invisible mouth, brownish skin, and 4 fingers on each hand. He said their fingers were damp and rough, so this does sound like grays. The beings proceeded to examine his body, touching his arms and fingers. He said they used an instrument to scrape his back near his shoulder blades. They then poked something into his left ear. Vanderlei was then floated off the table, out of the room, to another dark room, and he felt as though he was floated up towards the ceiling. And it was then that he was shown enigmatic images seemingly projected down from the ceiling. He was really unable to describe them, except for one, which showed the face of a normal-looking human, someone he did not recognize. During the hypnosis, he trembled throughout the entire session. The hypnosis then revealed that he was then returned to the spot where he had been taken and felt extremely cold. And that was all he was able to recall. Again, a fairly straightforward onboard UFO encounter. The event that most people will experience when taken on board is being physically examined. That does seem to be one of the primary reasons people are taken on board. And that's exactly what this gentleman describes. And yes, it was recalled through hypnosis, but again, he had pretty good indications of absolute, full awake contact. I mean, he was awake when the 3 ETs entered into his room. He was awake when he had this sighting. There's other indications that this was an entirely physical experience, but certainly a fascinating case. So now let's move to the next one, which I call I Wasn't Harmed in Any Way. This occurred in August 1993 in Paulsboro, New Jersey. It's a single witness case. This one was recalled consciously, but as a dream is how the witness kind of felt that this experience was. That's how she explained it. It wasn't until she started hearing about other people's experiences that she realized how closely her, quote, dream matched other people's fully conscious experiences. And looking at the details that she described that match up so well with other encounters, I think it's pretty clear that this was a real experience. But you can make up your own minds about it. The witness in this case is still looking for answers and admits that she remains unsure whether her experience was a dream or an actual encounter. But after watching a video about an onboard encounter, the similarities to her quote dream shocked her. As she writes, "It raised the hair on my neck. It was almost exactly what happened to me." It was a summer night in 1993. She was in her home in Paulsboro, New Jersey, and she had this same exact quote dream for 7 consecutive days in a row. The dream never varied in detail. It was always exactly the same. The witness is anonymous, so I'll call her Becky, but here she describes what she recalls from her quote dream, or as the case may be, a physical encounter. As Becky says, "I would be awoken in the middle of the night. There would be 3 to 5 small grays, about 3 or 4 feet tall. They had the large black eyes, no hair or noticeable clothing on their grayish bodies. They never spoke to me directly, but I knew I had to go with them." So in her dream, Becky found herself inside what appears to be an extraterrestrial craft. As she says, "I would be taken by these grays to a place that was very bright, almost like fluorescent lights, but with no light fixtures any place. All the doors and hallways seemed smooth, as if carved from a solid object. There were no sharp edges any place. After walking for a few minutes, we would go to another bright room with a table in the middle. I don't remember seeing any tools or windows. The table was very cold when I was directed to lie on it." So these are all details that other contactees describe again and again. Becky then describes a procedure that is very well known to contactees, which is being examined by the extraterrestrials. As Becky says, "Another much larger gray-like creature comes into the room and directs the smaller ones to leave. This one is very tall and almost human-like. He reassures me that I will not be harmed and I will be returned home. And never spoke to me directly, he spoke to my mind. And I remember being scared, but not terrified. He did tests on my reflexes, eyes, mouth, tongue, and ears that I can remember. I wasn't harmed in any way, as it told me. It also never told me why I was being taken, but when he was finished, he left, and the other smaller grays returned to lead me back. I always finished with the smaller grays leading me back to my bedroom and placing me into bed. I would wake up the next morning as if nothing had happened." So at that time, Becky was not familiar with the idea of being taken on board a UFO and examined by gray ETs, so she really wasn't sure what to make of these dreams or memories. But it was clear to her that these were not normal dreams. And now, hearing about other people who've had these same exact experiences, she believes it's entirely possible that she may have had an onboard encounter. But as Becky says, "I'm not totally sure what happened to me. I've always wrote it off as dreams. But if these were dreams, they never were different. It was the same dream for about 7 straight days. I've told this experience a time or two, and now I'm really curious as to what really happened. Was it dreams or was I taken?" So Becky is still searching for answers. You can see how difficult it is for people to process these experiences from that case alone. People often think, could this be a dream? Am I going crazy? Was this real? It's very difficult to process. So I fully understand how people have a difficult time coming forward or even sharing this with other people, because they themselves have all kinds of questions. Almost always these kinds of cases raise more questions than answers. That's again one of the reasons I do this research and present these cases, because I know so many people out there, so many of you, are having these kinds of encounters. So now let's move to the next one. I call this one, "Let Me Remember." This occurred one evening in spring 2005 in Wallingford, Connecticut. This one, of all the cases I present today in this episode, I think this one is my favorite. It's a really poignant case. I found it super fascinating. The witness is clearly sincere and was able to have a conversation with the ET that took her on board. This amazing case comes from a woman who has requested anonymity, and she admits that she herself is unsure about what happened to her. It was a warm spring night in 2005. She was in her home in Wallingford, Connecticut. It was after midnight and she was dozing in bed waiting for a friend to call when suddenly the windows began rattling. So she sat up in bed and immediately heard a telepathic message saying very clearly, "You will not be harmed. Come to the door." Now the witness is 4 foot 10 inches, disabled, she walks with a cane, and this telepathic voice said, "Unlock the door." Now at this point, she turned to her left and was amazed to see a humanoid creature looking at her. And as she says, it was about 5 feet tall, large black eyes, with a large head, a skinny body. The thing that struck me at the time was the grayish-white body. It wasn't the typical gray. I think it had only 4 fingers. The gray said again, telepathically, "Unlock the door. You won't be harmed." The witness said at this point, "Fine, but I remember everything. You don't take my memories. You let me remember." I didn't hear a yes or no, but I felt like he understood me. So I unlocked the door and went out. Now at this point, she stopped and stared directly at the gray face to face, getting a very close-up look. And she asked the gray, "Can I touch you?" As she says, so he held out his arm, very thin. My bones are thin, and his arm may have been more thin than even mine. I also noticed that it had arm hair like us, but unlike human hair that is soft and lays flat. It had very stiff hair that stood straight up. Its skin was smooth, but sort of bumpy, like a lizard's might feel. Didn't look like a lizard though. It had feet, legs, arms and hands. So now the gray began to lead the witness out of her house into the field behind her home. She had her cane in her hand and used it to help her walk forward. And as she says, we started walking again. This time it rested his hand on my arm, but I felt like it was more to assert more control, maybe to avoid more delays, who knows. We walked to the end of the deck ramp, then down a grassy slope to the right. At the bottom, I looked up and I saw the outline of a very dark craft. I only saw it because the moon, which was mostly behind the clouds, barely lit up an outline of the craft. It had 3 lights, one towards each side and one in the corner. I only remember the one in the center, which was blue, pulsating a bit. A crystalline, clear blue beam about 3 feet around came down. I noted that it didn't glow or radiate light outward like any normal light might. It seemed to cut through the night. Now the gray told her, "Step into the center." And she did. She thought to herself, how cool the light is. At this point the gray spoke again, still telepathically, "Don't touch the light and keep your hands at your side." And at that point the witness found herself being levitated into the craft. As she says, "Then I went up." It got fuzzy there quick. I remember turning to see the same being standing to the left of a chair, and behind him was a screen. I saw my home, then in a flash the earth. Then I looked to my right, and I saw to the far right the wall, which looked like a liquid silvery material, essentially melt away from right to left, revealing an examination room. Now, having been in many hospitals due to her disabled condition, the witness was very familiar with medical examinations, and she immediately recognized the hospital-like setting. She had long gotten over her fear of medical exams. As she says, "I've been in a ton of hospitals. I know what they look like. I was not remotely afraid." From there I started walking towards it. I've been experimented on my whole life by human doctors. I didn't really care. The next thing I know, I was waking up in my bed, lying flat, covers over me. So she looked at the clock and saw that it was now 3 a.m., at least an hour and a half later than it should have been. She immediately told herself that the whole experience must have been a dream. But she wondered if maybe it could have been real too. As she says, "I have some nagging questions. Like, why do I remember this dream so clearly? Why do I remember walking barefoot down the hall and outside? More odd, why was that literally the only dream I have ever had where I could even see my feet or feel my legs? And why do I remember using my cane when in my entire life I have never had a dream where I used a cane ever?" The witness is still somewhat reluctant to call the experience real, but she decided to report it in the hopes of getting some clarity. As the witness says, "I just don't know. I am only doing this to find out if anyone has ever had a similar experience. I still believe it was most likely a dream, but I will say this. It It was the most real dream I have ever had in my entire life, to the point that I still struggle with the question of, was it a dream or not? So like most people who have this kind of experience, the witness is left with more questions than answers. What an amazing case. Again, we see that pattern of people struggling to process their experience, just trying to figure out, was this just a dream? Was it a real experience? She remains undecided, even to this day, apparently. And I think actually that argues more for the credibility of the case, because she's not insisting that this actually happened. Just judging from the details she describes, it matches so many other accounts. I personally think it's real. I can't say for sure. I didn't speak with the witness firsthand, but it's absolutely an astonishing case. Now let's move to the next one. This is another really interesting case. I like this one because the witness was able to hold a conversation with the ETs. He asked them why he'd been taken on board, and he got an answer. I call this one, "We are looking at your DNA." This occurred on May 20, 2013 in Pleasantville, New Jersey, and it's just an amazing case in so many ways. We call the witness in this case Cody, that is a pseudonym. He reported his encounter only 2 days after it happened, writing, "Up until 2 nights ago, I've always been a skeptic of aliens and UFOs, but I feel lost and confused, and that's why I'm here." It was one evening at the end of April in 2013. Cody was outside his home and he was amazed to see something very unusual. This is in Pleasantville, New Jersey, and as Cody says, "I saw an unidentified object that looked like a fireball in the sky. And since then, I have had a feeling like I am being watched." So this feeling persisted over the next 3 weeks. Then, on the evening of May 20, 2013, Cody believes that he was taken on board an extraterrestrial craft. As he says, "As I was about to go to sleep, I saw something in my room through my peripheral vision. I don't remember going to sleep, but I do remember waking up in a metal room. I was lying on a metal bed and I was restrained. I struggled to turn my head and I saw many people lying in those metal beds like mine. I focused on one in particular, which I realized was my sister. It seemed that everyone was in some state of unconsciousness. At that point, I realized that something was very wrong, and I was conscious of the scary situation I was in. I started to panic and tried to free myself." Now, Cody does not report seeing anything actually holding him down, but nevertheless he was unable to move. And as he struggled, several short gray aliens appeared around him. As Cody says, "At that point, I realized I was surrounded by short beings. They were grayish in color and seemed oblivious to the fact that I was trying to fight my way out of the restraints. Suddenly, out of nowhere came a bright light, and another being appeared. This one was taller and had a more oval-shaped head with indentations in it. It was almost tan in color. It communicated with me telepathically." Now at this point, Cody's fear left him, and a short conversation ensued. Cody asked the tall alien, "What are you doing with us?" And the ET replied telepathically, "We're looking at your DNA." Cody then asked, "Why are you doing this to us?" And the ET replied, "All humans have DNA, but not all humans have the same alien DNA." Cody continued to ask more questions, which the tall ET answered. And as Cody says, "I asked it where it was from, and it said, 'We come from Sirius.' And it also told me that they have been coming to me for a long time." At that point, it disappeared and my fear returned. And I started screaming from the top of my lungs. The next thing I remember is jumping up from my bed, screaming, waking up everyone in the house. I haven't slept for 2 nights now. Well, about that, pretty darn fascinating. What's interesting to me about this case is it does display a pattern that I've seen over and over again, where someone has a UFO sighting and then it's shortly after that that they are taken on board. And that's absolutely what happened to this gentleman. And yeah, an interesting case because he was able to hold a conversation with the ETs, who not only explained why they had taken him on board, but also where they came from. I am sure that there's a lot more information to that case, as with all of these cases. So what we're looking at is really only a brief glimpse of what's going on in these people's lives. Let's move to the next case. This is the last one in this compilation and super fascinating. I call this one, It Wasn't a Dream. This occurred on August 11, 2014 in Massillon, Ohio. To me, the most fascinating aspect of this case is when it happened. At the time this person was taken on board, he was suffering somewhat of a crisis, asking very deep questions about his life, why he was on Earth, and so forth. This is a pattern I see quite a bit. People are taken on board in moments in their life when there's a lot of change going on. Could be the birth of a child, or the death of a loved one, or a marriage, or a breakup, or anything like that. So that pattern is absolutely showing up in this case, which I think you'll find really compelling. This report comes from Harold of Massillon, Ohio. That is a pseudonym, as the witness is anonymous. His onboard encounter occurred at a time in his life when he was asking very deep questions about the meaning of his life. As Harold says, I did not believe in alien abduction before this happened. I know it wasn't a dream. I was at home, lying in my bed, writing a song. I was really depressed, and I didn't know why I was still alive and what my purpose was. I wasn't tired or anything, but I guess I must have fallen asleep or something, because the next thing I know, I'm lying on a bed. It was hard and felt like metal under my body. I was naked. So after finding himself unclothed and lying on this table, the next thing Harold noticed is that he was not alone. As he says, I could only turn my head a little, and looking around, I saw gray beings, but not short. They were tall, I'd say about 6 feet. They had eyes the shape of almonds. They had no clothing on. They didn't walk. They moved so smoothly. I started to panic because 3 of them started towards me. All of a sudden, I get this voice in my head to turn to the right. So Harold turned his head and was concerned to see alien-looking equipment dangling above him. He said they looked almost like flexible tubes, but it was at this time he saw a tall being standing right next to him. And as Harold says, his head was gray. He had almond-shaped eyes, but his body was like liquid universe. He told me not to be afraid, but he didn't speak it. It was like he was in my head speaking. All of a sudden, I get this sharp burning pain in my ankle. I tried to move. I tried to do something, but I was being held down by some force, or maybe paralyzed. Again, this main being came right over me and looked down at me. I could feel tears going down my face. So speaking telepathically, Harold asked the being, "Why is this happening?" The being answered him, but Harold wasn't quite sure what this answer meant. As Harold says, he smiled, but I didn't see the smile, I felt it. He told me that I needed to tell them something. I can't remember what I'm supposed to tell them, and I don't know who I'm supposed to tell it to. But looking back above him, Harold again saw the strange tubes hanging from the ceiling, and when he saw what happened next, he quickly became understandably alarmed. As Harold says, one of them started to slowly come down towards me. As it got to my right eye, it went from limp and soft to hard, and it had a point like a needle. As the needle-type tube was about to enter my right eye, the main being put his hand on my forehead. The next thing I know, I was up, and I'm looking out into space. I'm in a smaller UFO, looking out at the main UFO. When I left the big UFO, I was in a little ship, looking at it in space. The windows on the big cigar-shaped UFO looked like swirling water. So Harold said that everything at this point looked a little hazy, and he felt somewhat anesthetized, and that's all he could really remember. As Harold says, the next thing I know, I'm laying back in my bed 2 hours later. My left ankle felt like it was on fire. I put my hand down there and felt a mark. It was diamond-shaped. It looked like it had already started healing as a scar. For the next week, I had a hard time walking on that foot. It felt like something was burning inside my ankle. 2 years later, Harold was still feeling some of the effects from this encounter. As he says, it's now 2016. I still have the diamond-shaped scar, but it's very light. You can feel on my ankle where this thing is. I don't know what they did when they stuck that tube needle into my eye. I really want to find a way to remember what I am supposed to tell them, whomever them is. Ever since this, I have become a recluse. I want to know what happened to me that night, and why did they do these things to me? Will they visit me again? What do they want? An amazing case, and it again shows the pattern of how difficult it is to process these kinds of events. He was affected on multiple levels, this witness. Physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. This is something that most people remember for the rest of their lives, if they actually do remember their encounter, because there is good indications that some people don't remember this at all. Missing time can be seamless. I think there's a lot of people out there who are contactees and don't even know it. But again, we can put any theories that this is explainable only by hypnotic regression to rest. That's not true. This gentleman recalled his experience fully consciously, as do many people. So yeah, these cases are tremendously important. They have so much to teach us. It definitely is time that they are taken more seriously. So that's it for today. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Thank you very much for watching. I truly appreciate it. And until next time, keep asking those hard questions. Keep searching for the truth. Most important of all, keep having fun, and I will see you next week. Bye for now.